Hi, and welcome to the Allplane Podcast, where you will find fresh stories of innovation in the commercial aviation industry. But first of all, my usual reminder that you can find all the previous episodes of this podcast, as well as many other aviation stories, on our website. That's allplane.tv, Allplane.tv. Well, it's been a while since our last episode. I've slowed down a little bit during the summer months, but here I am, ready to bring you a whole new season, back with new amazing guests that will bring us fresh insights about some of the most exciting developments that are happening right now in aviation. For the first episode of this new season, I have invited Robin Riedel, a partner at top strategy consulting firm McKinsey. Robin is an aerospace engineer and an A320 commercial pilot by background, but for more than a decade now, he has been leading a career as a consultant at McKinsey, based out the firm's San Francisco office, where he leads a disruptive aerospace sector practice. I follow and read pretty much everything that Robin and his team at McKinsey publish on a regular basis, covering some of the key aspects of the advanced air mobility revolution that is unfolding right before our eyes. From the structure of the new aerospace value chain that is emerging, to financial aspects of eVTOL development, and of course the quest to decarbonize aviation through cleaner propulsion technologies. So, without further ado, let me welcome Robin to the podcast for a fascinating and insightful talk about the realities and perspectives of innovation in the air mobility industry. Hi, Robin. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks so much for having me, Miguel.
It's a pleasure. I've been following you for quite some time, always posting very interesting stuff on LinkedIn and also on McKinsey's own website. But first of all, let me introduce you. You are a partner at McKinsey. Many listeners possibly know it's one of the top, if not the top, consulting firm in the world. You are in the Disruptive Aerospace Sector group or practice, I don't know how you call it, which is part of the aerospace and defense practice at McKinsey. That's basically a global role, although you are based in California, in San Francisco. What else can you tell us about your role, about your career? Because you started as an aerospace engineer. You're also a commercial pilot in the past. You've been flying A320s, and now already for a number of years, you've been this aerospace practice at McKinsey. So tell us a bit more about yourself.
Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Look, I think I look at myself really as, as an aviation enthusiast in a professional sense. I'm very much also personal, have a personal life. I'm a father and a husband. But when it comes to work, and a lot of my fun time too, quite frankly, has to do with aviation. I grew up in a bit of an aviation family. My father was a pilot, my grandfather was a pilot. And so I got to learn aviation early on. And I got my pilot's license. I studied aerospace engineering. I ended up flying larger airplanes at some point, then joined a big airline in different management roles, and finally ended up at McKinsey. And I think all of those things kind of connect together with the passion for aviation and having kind of grown up in an industry that is constantly changing, but yet we haven't really seen the kind of change that we're about to see in the coming years, in decades, if ever. I mean, What we're about to witness when it comes to, aviation becoming sustainable, finding new modes, it's just very exciting. And for someone who lives aviation as a, enthusiast, this is a fantastic time. And the role at McKinsey gives me a chance to really see this unfold around the world and across the value chain. And, it's a lot of fun and exciting.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, yeah, and actually that's what I would like to talk about today, because you are pretty much in the thick of it when it comes to innovation, both on the sustainability side, which is one of the major areas where we're going to see, I guess, lots of innovation coming through the next few years, but also when it comes to new business models and new technologies that are expected to disrupt the way we move around by air in the coming years as well. The flying taxi or flying cars that for many decades was sort of a science fiction thing might be just around the corner. So it's just I'm not quite sure that people that are not following this industry closely are aware of where we are at this point in time. Because we are talking now about some of the most advanced projects. They are talking about a time horizon of about 2, 3, 4 years to go operational. So that's really nothing in
in terms of time.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a unique moment in time for air mobility, right? Because a couple of global trends are coming together here that enable what I would call a whole new ecosystem of flying, right? And maybe let me describe those trends first. Now, I'll share then what it will look like for those, as you say, most people can't really imagine what it might be. But I mean, the big trends coming together, one of them is certainly technology, right? We're now at a point where electrified aviation, so that means using electric motors instead of combustion motors, which gives you the ability to do very different aerodynamic designs and very different control mechanisms. It has reached a level where it is actually deployable at passenger carrying aircraft, right? And so whether that is battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell electric or even hybrid electric, right? All of those technologies are at a point where we can actually make it work. Similarly, AI, by the way, and data usage has come a long way. And so we use a lot of that in terms of flight controllers and how we're going to manage the airspace, et cetera. So technology has gotten to a point over the last couple of years where some of these early dreams of, the Jetsons and, having really much more short range, smaller aviation is becoming feasible technically. I think the second big trend is really ride sharing and the willingness of people to think about mobility as a service rather than, owning your own car or your own bicycle or your own motorcycle. We're getting more and more into, sharing and using mobility as a service. And, the big ride hailing companies have done a lot for that, but you see this in multiple different areas in mobility. And so this really allows us to think about not do I sell a flying car to individuals, which might be really expensive, but providing a flying car as a service to individuals, which really unlocks that market. So ride hailing and mobility as a service is kind of a second big mega trend. Mm-hmm. I think a third one that's really important here is really sustainability. And, sustainability is a big topic in aviation. It's a really important topic. We need to tackle it. And electrification provides a pathway for these new aircraft to really be sustainable from the beginning. And while I probably don't quite see it as a way to decarbonize aviation or transportation, because we'll have other ways to do that as well, I do see it as a license to grow. By being sustainable, these new modes will be allowed to actually grow and scale up. So those are some of the big trends that converge. Now you add to that, emerging middle classes, urbanization in some countries, deurbanization in others, and just traffic congestion and where, certain cities just don't have any space anymore to add physical infrastructure like roads, right? I mean, think about the cost it would be to add another road or a tunnel or a subway in a city like New York or London or even Beijing. And so as a result, this all comes together and says, look, if we go into the vertical dimension, we can actually make it happen now. It's feasible and it might provide us another way of mobility. Now, let me share what I think this might look like. And of course, there's different views on this in different incarnations.
Yeah. If I might say something here, because there are two different sides of this story. I think one of them is the technology side, and that's what's feasible and what's not feasible. And I think we are, when I say we, I mean, I say industry, society as a whole. Obviously, there's a whole range of entrepreneurs working on this type of concept. I think there's around like 200 or 300 eVTOL startup projects at the moment in the world, in different parts of the world, working on different concepts and solutions, which makes me think maybe that we are at a point that might be something similar to what happened in the early 20th century, in the 1920s, where you had all these guys creating new aircraft types and new concepts. Some of them didn't go anywhere, but some of them actually did create very durable and valid concepts. So so we had all this technology side, and that's something that you've been writing about, is the business side of it. So what's the value chain? Who are going to be the operators? Are we going to have the airlines, the OEMs, the airports, all the supply chain of spares, maintenance, and also all the software to manage this, which is also a very important part. So we have all these two sides. So often we hear about the technology side, but I think what you guys at McKinsey have been doing, and I think that's very interesting, is try to quantify a little bit. There's this report I'm going to post a link to, where you kind of break down what you think is going to be the value chain of this new future air mobility industry.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It will take a whole ecosystem to make this work, right? And I think we'll start with a lot of focus on the aircraft, because that's, a very tangible piece of it. And until you have an aircraft, you really don't have much. And so a lot of the funding is going into aircraft, a lot of the attention is going into aircraft, and how do we build them, certify them, design them, and then manufacture them. But if you think about, traditional aviation, if you think about airlines today, only about 10%, and in many cases less than 10% of your ticket price actually goes to the aircraft, right? The rest goes to things like pilots, fuel or energy, airports, the booking platform, travel agencies, right? And so as we think about this future, mobility mode or future air mobility mode, it's reasonable to think that, a large chunk of the value creation, a large chunk of the revenue will happen not with the aircraft, but in other parts, right? And so I think a number of the eVTOL players recognize that they've started to vertically integrate, or they've build business plans where they do more than just building the aircraft. And it could go anywhere from building parts and components all the way down to operating and having a mobility platform, and running the customer-facing app, including, all the different things in between, like maintenance, like ground infrastructure, et cetera. At the same time, you have a number of industry players from other industries or from adjacent industries stepping in, right? So you have airport operators and airport infrastructure investors who are saying, we're going to play here and we're going to build vertiport infrastructure for this. You have traditional aerospace component manufacturers who are saying, we want to build parts here. You got automotive players doing the same thing. You got airlines and other aircraft operators, helicopter operators, business jet operators saying, we want to do the operation of this. And so we're seeing this interesting ecosystem emerge where at the center right now, you still have a big focus on the vehicle, but more and more, the rest of the ecosystem is emerging. And it's an exciting time to think about where in this ecosystem is really going to be value created and where is it going to be destroyed. And, as you're a company and think about that, you want to make sure you invest in the places where you will make returns and not where you're going to subsidize the rest of the industry.
One thing I would like to add is that the actual transportation of passengers usually gets most of the attention, but there's a whole section of the civilian aviation industry. I'm not even getting into the military side of aerospace, but in the civilian aviation industry, there are a whole lot of uses for aviation that are not typical, let's say, airline moving from, let's say, from New York to Washington or something like that. It's things like training, general aviation, cargo, agriculture applications, surveying applications, aerial survey. But the part of the aviation that covers distances of up to 500 miles, you quantify that, I think, at 17% of total emissions. That could be completely electrified pretty much with the technology we have now, without having to wait for big breakthroughs in battery technology, stuff like that. So that's already quite a significant part. So we're talking almost a quarter, almost a fifth of the aviation emissions. What else do you see happening here? I mean, do you see this electrification as inevitable? How do you see all the different approaches to decarbonizing aviation working all together? Airbus made this big push for hydrogen, but we are seeing lots of activity in sustainable aviation fuel, and it seems it might be a more pragmatic approach. I don't know. How you see all this race to decarbonize?
Yeah, look, I think it's an exciting and important discussion, partially because we need to decarbonize, but also because there's so much uncertainty in this. And as you say, there's trade-off between the different solutions. And so my view is that all of the solutions you mentioned, right, whether it's electrification, whether it's hydrogen, combustion, or whether it's sustainable aviation fuels, will have to play a role. So let's unpack a little bit why I say that, right? I think on the one hand, to decarbonize soon and quickly, sustainable aviation fuel is the most pragmatic and, near-term solution. And the other thing that it's a drop-in solution, meaning we can literally keep the same technology today, the same aircraft and the same ground infrastructure and, use them with that. And that is a big, important point because, the aircraft we build today, once they get delivered, they're expected to last 30 years. And financially, you calculate them to last 30 years or so. And so every 737 MAX and every A320 Neo that's rolling out of a factory today is expected to last till 2030-ish. And so that means if we want to decarbonize by 2030, we either have to find a way to use that technology or we have to retire it early. And if we were to retire all these aircraft early and try to replace them with other technology, we're talking about trillions of dollars in early write-offs of assets, which from an economic sense, just doesn't work for an industry. And so I think sustainable aviation fuel is really the way to decarbonize some of that. It also, works with long-range aircraft and large aircraft where some of the novel propulsion technologies are a little bit harder to have, make happen at this point. So sustainable aviation fuel is a big, important part of the parts to decarbonization. Now, it does have a few challenges, right? I think there's a challenge around, you're still burning, fuel at high altitude. And so some of the effects that are not just carbon, but that are, other emissions coming out of the aircraft, contrail formation, all of that is still happening with sustainable aviation fuels to a lesser degree in some cases because the fuel is a little bit cleaner and burns cleaner. But fundamentally, you still have some of those other climate impact effects. And so, it's not the perfect solution. And that's why it's important we keep working on some of these other solutions. And so two I would mention in particular. One is electrification, which really means using electricity to drive, the propulsor. And the power source could be batteries, or it could actually be hydrogen fuel cells. But that is a technology that will allow us to build very different type of aircraft, because now we can put the propellers or the propulsors all over the airplane. Because electric aviation, it doesn't need large scale. It doesn't need large engines to be efficient. And so that allows us to build different types of aircraft, which are more efficient. I think battery technology and hydrogen fuel cell technology is advancing. And, I have no doubt that, by the end of this decade, early next decade, we will have regional aircraft that are powered electrically, and that'll scale up over time. And, I applaud many of the entrepreneurs who are out there trying to do this, and some of the OEMs trying to do that. So electrification to me is going to be a big part. And as you mentioned, for a lot of the short range flights today, so about 17% or so of the emissions come from that. And for all of the emerging new aviation on the low end, so advanced regional aviation or urban air mobility, advanced air mobility, all of that, electricity can help us make that decarbonized.
Yeah.
And then just to mention the last one. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I just wanted to mention here is about all this short-haul flying, that we are seeing actually on one side lots of pressure about basically abolishing the short-haul flying, like carbon emitting short-haul flying. But then we might find that in 5, well, maybe 5 is a bit optimistic, but in 10 years time, if actually we are flying a lot more in the short-haul because of all these changes. I don't know whether the public debate has moved that far. I mean, because I think in Germany, for example, I saw a statistic saying like half of Germans want to ban short-haul flights in the short term and all that. But I don't know how prepared the public opinion is for all this amount of short-haul flying and all the new use cases. So having planes landing closer to their homes, going to places where you would never think about flying today, but maybe it will be feasible in the future. So I'm just concerned that it might be feasible technologically, but you would still have lots of concerns at societal level that make all this change slower than it should be.
For sure. And I wouldn't even say as it should be, because I would say these are valid concerns. And I think, as an industry, we need to bring the public along. So I go back to say the table stakes here, what has to be, non-negotiable is that this needs to be sustainable, right? So I think these short haul, new aerial modes need to be, at the very least carbon neutral, right? But even better, end-to-end, circular. And so I think that is just a license to operate and grow. Without that, we're not going to go there. Now, beyond the sustainable part from an environmental perspective, you also have noise, you have visual pollution, right? And so those things we need to address as well. And I'm very encouraged by many of the eVTOL designs that are actually really quiet. I just had a chance to go to one of the operators and see an aircraft and actually hear it. And it sounds like it really hums like a air conditioning unit, in the background. It does not sound anything like a helicopter today or a jet aircraft today. So I'm very excited about the opportunity there to really bring down the noise pollution. Visual pollution is another topic I think we'll need to address. And then lastly, of course, safety. I think aviation obviously has been one of the safest travel modes or mobility modes, over the last years. And we need to make sure that all these new things that come in, eVTOLs and drones, et cetera, keep that standard and keep high to that standard. Because one interesting change is happening here. With traditional aviation, we were really mostly concerned about the people on board the aircraft, because you usually flew high. You had very few incidents where the aircraft crashed on the ground and, really did a lot of collateral damage on the ground. And so the focus was on the aircraft. Now, when you fly smaller aircraft, but closer to the ground, closer to people in urban centers, all of a sudden you really need to think differently about this and say it's not just the people on the airplane, it's also the people on the ground, because the aircraft might not have a lot of time to get out of the way, to steer away from the city. The aircraft might, really cause some damage in the in the populated areas if there was a safety issue. And so as a result, we need to think about that as well as we're developing this industry. So yeah, absolutely. Safety and environmental noise and visual they're topics we just need to address head on, and we need to make sure that we really bring society along and the communities, right? And I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing, because there's enough initiatives out there really trying to do that and really being thoughtful about how do we build something that is additive to society at large and not just a toy for the rich that has externalities on everybody else.
Yeah, just to provide some numbers for the audience. Actually, I'm quoting one of your papers on McKinsey's website. You mentioned that there are, I think, in the world as a whole, around 3,000 commercial airports, but the number of regional airports, underused regional airports or airfields that could be used by new air mobility vehicles, then we jump to 36,000. So that's more than 10 times more, just to give an idea of the scale of what we're talking about. The air activity would multiply.
The activity would multiply for sure. And I think that is the part where we need to make sure it doesn't create a lot of externalities. Yeah. But also the convenience and the accessibility would multiply. Yeah. Right. Because if you think about, most people today going to the airport is it's a journey, right? It's not, right next door. It's not something you quickly do. And then the airports are massive and it takes a lot of time to get through them. And if we want to do short haul flying and want to really provide a benefit to people, it has to be close to you, accessible. It has to be a simple process. And so much of this, call it underused infrastructure, right? And in the US, of course, we have a ton of it. And then other countries do too, can be used to really build a network and make this easy. And there's a number of players starting to do that. There's small regional airlines popping up in places that are, flying from these shorter airports, smaller airports on shorter routes that are, you have no long security lines. You don't have, a half-hour walk from the parking garage to the terminal, right? Mm-hmm. Things are smaller, easier to use, and customers love it, and they find it accessible and, are flocking to those models. And so now if we could combine that with a electric aircraft or a green aircraft at lower cost, that seems like it could really take off and really provide the benefit to society and to the travelers in general.
Yeah, no, that's one of the things that gets me interested in what's going on is actually how this is going to connect with the overall transport ecosystem, and also about the capacity, because most of these things are pretty small. So we're talking normally of up to 19 seats, the largest, but some of these concepts carry like 2, 3, 4 people. So if they are to make a significant dent on other types of transportation, you would need lots and lots of them. And even then, the amount of people in absolute numbers possibly is not that big. So I'm just thinking here about things like air traffic control. So I guess that falls between what you mentioned earlier, the new ecosystem, the new supply chain. I mean, there has to be a lot of innovation going into optimizing these type of things, I guess. Not just the hardware, but also all the connectivity and all, like, to make all of these smooth.
Absolutely. No doubt, right? And I think there's a lot of challenges we need to overcome as an industry. This is not like a slam dunk in itself. I think we'll spend a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of brain power and mind share to really unlock all these different things. And that's why, Bill Gates, I think, once said, we overestimate what we can do in 2 years, but underestimate what we can do in 10 years. And I think the same will apply here. I think right now there's a lot of hype around, especially eVTOL and kind of the shorter range. And, certainly I hope we're going to get there by 2024, 2025, but I wouldn't be surprised if it takes us a few years longer, just because some of these things you just mentioned just will take some time to crystallize, at least before we can get to scale. But then if I look 10 years into the future, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't be able to solve those problems, right? Yeah. In many cases, we're not talking about science or physics here. We're talking about engineering, right? As we know the answer, we just need to actually build it. Mm-hmm. And so I think in those cases, time and will help. And I'm encouraged by the number of, the amount of funding that has gone in this industry, right? We've seen over $10 billion publicly announced funding in this industry. There's another probably 5 billion or so by strategic players who have not announced, big OEMs that do this in-house, et cetera. And so, that is a meaningful amount of money that can help us solve some of these challenges and actually build an industry. And is everybody going to be successful? No, absolutely not. There will be some people along the way who will struggle and maybe go away. But I certainly think that some people will make it, and we'll have a sort of ecosystem 10 years from now that'll bring us a different form of mobility.
Yeah, you touched a very important point is all the finance. We have seen a very prominent SPAC listings this year. Seems to be like a boom of SPACs, but it's not clear to me where all this capital to make this possible is going to come from. Is this money you mentioned, I think 10 billion, is this coming mainly from inside the industry? Is it coming from institutional investors? Have you guys looked into what's the structure of this capital coming in and make any forecasting about where is this coming from?
I mean, so look at a big chunk of the capital historically, until call it 18 months or so ago, was really coming from strategic investors, right? And so those were, some of the big OEMs, both on the automotive side or on the aerospace side, who's kind of, invested in this as part of their ongoing R&D, right? And so there's a couple of $1 billion that flew that way. I think then we saw venture capital stepping in, and we saw, early venture capital funding in some of these plays. So then in the last 18 months, I think we've seen two new, sources of funding emerge. I think one is, as you said, the SPAC money, so the special purpose acquisition companies, which are blank check companies that can merge with some of these startups to create new publicly traded companies. So it's just a different way to go to the public markets. And in the process, the money that's in the SPAC becomes, gets added to the balance sheet, but also money from a private investment that happens at the same time called the PIPE. And so we've seen a number of deals coming through that way, and some of them have closed, others are in the process of being closed. Depending on how hot the market is, there's a certain amount of money that gets pulled out before the deal closes, et cetera. So the money is not completely certain, but it is flowing in, and this is allowing these companies to get the hundreds of millions or close to billions of dollars that you need to really bring an aircraft to market and build up the manufacturing of it and the servicing of it. And so that has been an important source of funding. And, we've seen some deals close and some others will soon. And, that suggests that, the money will be there to develop that. And then last but not least, I think we've really seen an influx, in particular on the sustainable aviation side, of, call it environmentally focused funding, right? And so we see a number of the big funds out there, raising ESG focused funds or raising, environmentally focused funds. We see a number of the venture firms that are focusing on clean tech starting to invest in this space. And so that's really giving a boost to some of the more traditional aircraft configurations that are, becoming green with novel propulsion, right? And so that to me is an important signal. Now, we still need a lot more money. There's no doubt, right? Especially if we're talking about building, regional aircraft and, narrow body type aircraft that have capabilities to fly, a couple hundred or 1,000 miles with, 50, 100 passengers. That'll take additional funds, no doubt. But I am very encouraged by looking in the investment landscape today and see how much dry powder there is to really focus on solutions that will greenify the world. Mm-hmm. And so I'm hopeful that we'll see the funding come in, and I'm hopeful that we'll see these solutions come to life.
I'm just wondering at which point, when are we going to reach this kind of tipping point where the operators, like let's say airlines and other companies that manage the infrastructure would need to make the decision whether to go with a completely, like, let's say, new generation equipment, or just stretching the current. You will have a role here advising people what's the optimal strategy to follow.
It's true, but look, this is a perfect example of strategy under uncertainty.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because there's a couple of metrics here, figures of merit that we just don't know how they're going to develop. Right. Mm-hmm. Is battery density going to increase by 7% a year? Or are we going to see a step change, or are we going to plateau? We really don't know. Right. Are hydrogen fuel cells going to increase their efficiency in the next 10 years? We just don't know. Right. Are sustainable aviation fuels, are we able to really make power to liquid, so synthetic fuels from combining hydrogen and carbon? Are we going to be able to make that technology work at scale at the price point that people are? It's unknown, right? And so given that there's so much uncertainty into which solution is really going to play out at what price point and technology are they even possible, I think we need a portfolio approach as a world, right? We need to invest in a number of these things and have them compete and really try to drive out the optimum solution by investing in a number of solutions and see how they really pan out. And, yes, depending on what you believe about technology, about economics, about what policymakers will be doing, you can pick one or two or a different set of portfolios, portfolio companies to place your bets in. But fundamentally, I think as society, we just don't know what is the one answer. And that's why it's important we, really look at all these options and we really fund, multiple of these options, not just sustainable aviation fuels or not just electrification, but the range of that.
Yeah, one thing you've done though is at McKinsey is you try to quantify break down the value chain in different categories and see what's the magnitude of each of those. I would like to briefly touch upon this topic because that's quite interesting. And actually, I'm going to post a link to this report when there's a graph. But actually, when you look at the estimation of value chain breakdown for future mobility, what I see is that the actual hardware, it's a relatively small part. You allocate a lot of weight in a metaphorical way, not in terms of metal, but in terms of the value to things like the pilots, for example, which is explained by the fact that some of these new concepts carry relatively less people per aircraft than conventional airliners. Also infrastructure and mobility services. Mobility services are all these platforms, for example, as you mentioned, Uber-like technology to book rides and stuff like that. Can you explain me a little bit more in detail how you guys did these calculations? What are the assumptions?
Yeah, happy to. And look, as we say in the paper, right, this is one way of how the industry could play out, right? There's other scenarios of how it could play out, but we use this as an example or one of the more likely potential outcomes. And so let me cover a few things that you talked about. I think one, the vehicle is a relatively small share. I think we say the vehicle manufacturer is only, around 5% of the overall value. Now, you add to that the components, which is probably another 5 to 10, the battery, which is another 5-ish or so, and then, the financing of all of that and the infrastructure, you get more to about 25% or so of the, value of what you as a customer pay goes towards the vehicle, right? And I think that is...
One question here. Sure. Do you see the hardware part becoming more of a commodity in the long term? I do care, but for most people, they don't care if it's a Boeing 737 or an A320. I guess like many industry people now, they're going to scream at me, but it's fair to say that for 90% of passengers, they don't care that much about what's the make of the aircraft, as long as it's between certain parameters. Do you see this happening here as well? So you're going to care about, or is it going to be more like cars where people, like if you're driving a BMW or you're driving a Ford, it's a bit different.
Maybe if you drive yourself, right? But if you look at ride sharing, I couldn't tell you what were the last 5 car types that I was in ride sharing, right? Because when you're not driving yourself and when you don't own the vehicle, I think many of us, don't spend as much attention to what is the OEM. And so I'm not sure if I would use the word commoditized per se, because I think this is still high-tech equipment, True. Right? But I do think we're going to end up in a world that looks more like cars today with, a number of players building these vehicles in very similar than in an aviation environment where we have, only a handful of players who really build large aircraft, right? And so I think it'll be more like it is in cars today. And people will differentiate themselves by having different features, by building different brands, by going from upscale versus a low scale. But fundamentally, I do think, many of the travelers will probably not be able to tell the difference between the manufacturers that they're in. Now, when it comes to operators, they might, right? Because I could tell you what was the ride-hailing company that I used for my last ride-hailing rides. I just wouldn't be able to tell you what the car type was, right? So I think that's why the mobility services, so the part of how do you book, how do you engage with it, sees quite some value in our breakdown here, because that is where, the customer in the end of the day engages, right? And that's where the payment funnels through.
And the airline, obviously people know which airline they are flying. Most people do, at least.
More so than which airplane type. Yes,
exactly. So that's I think that's a good comparison. Then there's the pilot part, but does this calculation take into account potential automation of part of these fleets, or that's too far into the future yet to be
So
able to
in
quantify?
in this scenario, we did not consider autonomy because most of the eVTOL players today are suggesting they're going to start with piloted vehicles, right? There's a few that are going autonomous first, but they're not looking to start, in the next couple of years. And the reason really is that you're breaking so much new ground with these vehicles when it comes to propulsion, when it comes to infrastructure. Adding autonomy to that just creates an additional hurdle to really overcome when it comes to regulation and others. And I think people recognize that is probably one step too far if you want to accelerate the time to market. And so we believe you're going to have pilots on board of these aircraft in the beginning. And because these aircraft are relatively small, 1, 2, 3, maybe 5 passengers, the relative share or the ratio of pilots to passengers is going to be, relatively high for the pilot. And initially, these were going to be certified commercial airline pilots, right? Or at least commercial pilots. And, you go through a rigorous training for that. And, that creates certain costs that will be reflected. Now, we do have some work on how do we think this is going to play out, because there's a couple of challenges in this. I think one challenge is finding enough pilots, right? We have a pilot shortage already in commercial aviation on the horizon looming. And, we probably need another, 30 to 60,000 pilots or so for advanced air mobility by the end of the decade. And we've written about that in a white paper. And so getting the pilots is one thing. I think the other thing is, how do you really get them interested in this role, right? There's a few things that get me excited, right? Like, you're going to be home every night. Great. This is much better than in traditional airlines. And, that will attract a whole new kind of audience to this, or a whole new kind of segment of people to this role. But on the other hand, you're telling people, look, we want you to be a pilot, but in the background, we're working on automating these vehicles and getting rid of you because you're too expensive.
Yeah.
And so it's not something where, you could see people say this is a long-term career choice in itself. And so there's a number of challenges to overcome. And some of the eVTOL players have now started partnerships with flight training companies. They're actually starting their pipeline of pilots to build them up to really cover those problems. But yeah, pilots is going to be a very important topic in the initial years of this.
Are you expecting also other roles here, specialized roles that would need to be filled, not just the pilots, but in connection to this? Obviously, one of them would be all the technical servicing. So you would need to train all these 60,000 pilots, but also all the people doing all the maintenance, all of that. I'm not sure how's the industry going to handle this, whether there are already, I haven't been really following this specific segment of the industry, but are there already some initiatives to train people in these roles? Is it the OEMs that are preparing for this? What are your insights here?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the ecosystem as it's building is thinking about these things. And in terms of important roles other than pilots, right, we'll have to have maintenance staff that actually maintains these aircraft. We're going to have manufacturing staff, so engineers that build these aircraft. We're going to have ground handlers that manage the passengers and the aircraft on the ground. And all of those things are related but slightly different to what we do in automotive and aerospace today. Right. So, for example, the vehicles are going to be much simpler. There's going to be a few thousand parts, not tens or hundreds of thousands of parts in a vehicle like that. At the same time, it's going to be fully electrified, which is completely different than what airplanes are today. Right. And so dealing with high power electronics, dealing with chargers, the heat generation in that, managing batteries, when to replace them, how to replace them. There's a whole bunch of training that needs to go into the technical side and the aircraft handling side of that. And so we see a number of the eVTOL players starting up their own training programs. I was actually visiting one this week, which, already has ground crews. They have crew chiefs with ground crew to already practice how they're going to turn around the aircraft on a daily basis. How do they service it? How do they clean it? How do they wash the windows? How do they change the batteries? So they're very much in the process of learning how to do that and codifying that. And then, there's universities, vocational schools, training providers that are really thinking about this and getting excited about this new market, how it's starting up and starting to really invest into this. Now, if you were to step up and say, hey, I want to become an eVTOL mechanic, can I get that training today? Probably not quite yet, simply because there's no eVTOLs yet. But give it another 2 years and, that will absolutely be there.
One question in relation to this is, I'm not an engineer, so I'm not too familiar with all the different parts and components that go into these eVTOLs. Are they usually parts and spares that are not, I was about to say universal, not universal, but that have other users already in the, let's say, in existing applications, or how much of the machinery is custom made for eVTOL, and how much of it is actually things that already exist because they had other users prior to the eVTOL revolution?
Yeah, look, I think most parts, have some kind of other use as well and are adoptions, but they're still customized towards this application, right? I think there's a few things. So examples of that would be avionics, right? Most of the eVTOL players have announced that they're going to use pretty off-the-shelf avionics from current avionics manufacturers, right? Things like seats, things like flight controllers, many of these things are either light adoptions or, just straight out of existing technology. Now, there's certain things, especially around the propulsion system, right? So whether it's the motors or whether it's the battery packs or the hydrogen fuel cells, which really are custom made for this application, right? Because aviation has some very unique requirements, right? You need to be lightweight, you need to be very fire, suppressing, and so getting the combination right, and of course, by the way, high power and high energy density, both power and energy density, and high cycle life, for economic reasons. So there's some unique requirements that drive those things to be much more custom made.
And that's a secret sauce of that some of these manufacturers are actually betting on, right?
Absolutely. I think the propulsion system is going to be the big differentiator here, and also a place where real value is going to be created in the value chain.
Also, another interesting aspect that maybe is a bit too early to mention now, but give it 10 years and it's going to be important, is the residual value. I think there was a paper, I saw a paper, I don't know if it was yours or from some other source, I read it a few days ago, that was talking about estimation of the second-hand market and residual value of these vehicles, like in a few years' time. I'm going to look for it and post it as well in the notes. Right now, obviously, aircraft and helicopters have a well-established aftermarket. It helps that most of these aircraft have a very long operative life, so have long life cycles. But if we were to go like at the beginning of aviation, as we said earlier, 1920s, 1930s, most of these aircraft became obsolete very quickly. And it might happen again here. So you would have aircraft that become obsolete in 3-5 years rather than the 20-25 years or 30 years that you're seeing now in the industry. That's also interesting, has interesting implications particularly for finance, I guess.
Absolutely. I think, aviation today, it's very much asset-backed financing, right? So we understand how airplanes are going to, maintain their residual value. Banks are happy to lend against aircraft. We, see leasing companies because it's a well understood, market. And, it's based on understanding of residual values based on history. And I think the problem with eVTOL here is that these vehicles likely have a much faster product cycle life, right? In terms of when is the next generation going to come out? Like technology is going to march pretty fast. And so we're not going to see 30-year-long lifetimes of aircraft, I don't think. Right, but something much shorter. And so the question is really, okay, how do you get an industry that is used to lending against aircraft that last 30 years and that there are hundreds of millions of dollars, or at least tens of millions of dollars, to think about an industry that, has a vehicle that only lasts, a handful of years, but is also only a handful of millions of dollars in initial cost, and, might not have these multiple afterlives that current aircraft have. And I think my worry for the industry is a little bit that if we don't get our head around this soon, we're going to fall short of financing in the first years, because, players might step back and say, wait a minute, I don't really know how these assets are going to move. My accounting, my risk processes, et cetera, cannot really handle something where I have no good clue of what the residual value will be. And so I will wait a few years before entering this market, let the first couple of years pass till we see how it goes, and then I'll enter. And if that happens, we might see a crunch to not have enough cash to really purchase those aircraft to start operations. Now, some leasing companies have started to lean forward and have made announcements about purchases and are actively engaged. But I think overall, this remains a big challenge for the industry.
Or OEMs becoming operators themselves. I mean, we have seen I think, Lilium in Germany, and I spoke with Faradair, for example, in the UK, where they had mentioned plans to actually become more of an operator of their own equipment.
For sure, but the challenge remains, even if you're an operator of your own equipment,
you need to finance
still need funding to finance these planes. And I think the deals we see right now for funding, they get these players to build the aircraft, to build the manufacturing of the aircraft, but they don't really, have enough cash within that current funding to buy it. I mean, look, most of these aircraft are, let's say, around somewhere between $3 and $5 million. And the players want to produce a couple of hundred a year, right? So that's an additional $1 billion or so per year, that is needed in funding, which again, current financing doesn't include. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see how the industry will resolve that. And my hope is that, the banks and the financing organizations will get their head around that and, recognize the opportunity, but also find a way to assess the risk and, provide financing.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Before wrapping up, there's another segment where interesting things are happening that I would like to touch upon, and that's supersonic and hypersonic flight. There's some innovation taking place there. We have seen a couple of projects that folded recently, so that's definitely a very challenging segment, but one that, it's not entirely new because it existed in the past, not very profitable at the time, but there are some entrepreneurs that are making inroads. So what's your view on supersonic and hypersonic flight and how it fits with all this drive towards sustainability? Because it's got a bit of an image problem, I think, when it comes to flying faster. I know there's all the sustainable fuel use and all that, but there's still something there that not just technology, but also the perception of supersonic flight, I guess, it's going to find some barriers.
I think you sum it up well, right? I think, as I said earlier, I think sustainability is going to be the license to grow and the license to operate. And so unless you can be sustainable, I think it will be very hard for supersonic to take off. Mm-hmm. And sustainable aviation fuel will do a part to that. But you still have the challenge that you're burning fuels at a very high altitude with these aircraft, which has all kinds of non-carbon effects that need to be considered. So I'm cautious about that. I do also think that the problem with supersonic is that the market itself, obviously we all would love to fly faster and travel faster. But how many markets really lend themselves towards doing that? Right? I mean, yes, across the Atlantic in one direction, fantastic. But there's lots of flights where I say today, listen, if I arrived an hour or two earlier, it would be in the middle of the night. I'd rather sleep the 2 hours more on the plane, where I personally would go, yeah, maybe I don't quite need to pay a premium for supersonic or go faster. And so, I haven't seen, I've seen both sides of the argument, of course, but I haven't seen any compelling and really definitive work that would suggest that this is absolutely going to happen because the benefits are just so good and we can overcome the environmental challenges, right? Mm-hmm. Nor have I seen the absolute case that, hey, this cannot work because of XYZ. So I think it's going to be interesting how it plays out. The reality is it will still require billions of dollars in funding to make it happen. And we'll see if investors find this exciting enough to invest in it.
I don't know if you guys have looked into the linkages between what we're seeing now in space travel and potential applications for travel on Earth. So things like hypersonics or like ultra fast intercontinental travel, like things like going from, let's say, from Europe to Australia, from the US to China, going suborbital, these type of things that sound a bit like science fiction, but I know there are some startups out there looking into this, and obviously there's also like all the space entrepreneurs also lowering costs of sending things to orbit and all that. I don't know if you guys have looked into this. Have you done any calculations of whether this is feasible at some point in the future?
Yeah, I would say, look, it very much looks like it will be feasible. The question really is it economically feasible? And, does it really make sense for us to go that direction as a society, for, call it, broader at scale transportation, right? Because you are, dealing with a very different technology, which might come at a very different price point. And so I think in the next 10 years, we're not going to see that. Afterwards, to be honest, who can predict the future, right? True. I personally would be excited about it, but there's a number of issues, or challenges still to be overcome. But look, I'm very excited that there is players out there that are looking at that and, making the case for it. And, what we will learn as they kind of build these ventures, might tell us that, yeah, look, this is the way we want to travel in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think we can leave it here for today with all these many questions that I'm sure are gonna keep you, the consultants, busy for quite a lot of time, because there's lots of strategic choices here that operators will need to make in the coming years about many different aspects: financial, operational, business models, marketing, lots of stuff, lots of interesting things going on.
For sure. And look, I think, again, as an aviation enthusiast and someone who loves this industry, I think it's a unique time. It's an exciting time, and I'm glad I get to live in it.
For people that want to follow your thoughts on this, what's the best way to find your writings, your thinking? On McKinsey website, there's quite a lot of stuff that you're publishing regularly. Any other platforms or channels you would recommend?
Yeah, look, I mean, following me on LinkedIn is one way to just see what's on my mind. And, we publish our own research that way. We also talk about other research we read that we find interesting. And so that is one good pathway to see what we're thinking about. And then, of course, McKinsey.com, we have a future air mobility blog where we publish every couple of weeks our thoughts. So that's a good way to kind of keep in touch. And then also our white papers that we publish. And so, look, I think also if people are interested in having a deeper conversation on some of these topics, feel free to reach out to me directly. Probably LinkedIn is the best path to do so.
Excellent. So I'm going to post links to all of these resources that I'm sure are going to be interesting for many of those listening to us. Thank you so much for your time today, and definitely go check these reports and white papers, because they have very interesting thoughts, including all this breakdown of value chains that I found particularly interesting. Thank you very much, Robin, for your time today.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
A pleasure. Before you go, and if you like this podcast, a quick reminder that it would be absolutely great if you could please give it a rating on Apple, Spotify, or whichever platform you're using, or recommend it to a friend or whomever might be interested. Thank you very much, and see you soon.